The moment I pulled into my driveway, I knew something was off. You don't spend decades fine-tuning your instincts, negotiating high-stakes business deals, and leading a brand like Harley-Davidson without developing a sixth sense for trouble. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, but what caught my attention wasn't nature's beauty. It was a glaring, unnatural orange of a piece of paper, flapping angrily against my garage door. I felt a deep, instinctual unease. As I stepped out of my car and approached the paper, my stomach tightened. HOA violation. Margaret Whitmore's doing. Margaret was a self-proclaimed queen of our neighborhood. The kind of woman who ruled with an iron fist wrapped in overpriced silk gloves. She had an unrelenting obsession with control and an equally unrelenting hatred for motorcycles. We'd crossed paths only twice since I'd moved in 6 months prior, and both encounters left me with no doubt that she viewed herself as the sole arbiter of taste and order. The first time, she scolded me for my lawn being half an inch too tall. The second, she sent her husband with a measuring tape to confirm that my mailbox was a regulation distance from the curb. I pulled the notice from my garage door, my fingers tightening as I read the absurdity printed in her signature. Perfectly calligraphed handwriting. Violation. Unauthorized vehicle storage. Remove motorcycle within 48 hours or face immediate towing and fines. And, at the bottom, in an unnecessary flourish, motorcycles reduce property values and attract an undesirable element to our community. I stared at my pristine 2023 Harley-Davidson Road Glide, a machine of beauty, a masterpiece of engineering, and a symbol of freedom. It was worth more than Margaret's entire wardrobe of pretentious designer suits, and I had spent countless weekends carefully washing and polishing it in my driveway. In those weekends, I taught neighborhood kids about motorcycle maintenance, shared stories with Mr. Johnson from next door, and even let his grandson sit on the seat, watching his eyes light up like Christmas morning. And yet to Margaret, it was a plague upon her suburban utopia. As if on cue, she strode by in her designer exercise outfit, her platinum blonde hair frozen, in a style that defied movement. She didn't wave, didn't acknowledge me, just glanced at my bike with a disgusted expression, then tapped her overpriced smartwatch. The message was clear. Time was ticking. I wanted to walk right up to her, tell her exactly who she was messing with. But years in business had taught me a valuable lesson. Silence, when timed correctly, is more powerful than any outburst. Instead, I took out my phone and began documenting everything. If Margaret wanted to fight, she had just picked the wrong opponent. The next morning, before the sun even had the courtesy to rise, I was jolted awake by the piercing chime of my security system. Groggy but alert, I grabbed my phone and opened a live feed from my driveway cameras. What I saw made my blood boil. A blue tow truck, one I recognized all too well, was reversing into my driveway. Peterson's Towing, the same company that had suspiciously appeared overnight in our neighborhood's financial records. I barely had time to throw on a t-shirt and grab my keys before I heard the telltale clank of metal. Rushing outside, I was met with the gut-wrenching sight of my Harley being yanked onto the truck bed, already chained down like some stolen relic. The driver, a burly man with the dead-eyed expression of someone who had done this 1,000 times, didn't even flinch as I sprinted toward him. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" I barked. The driver didn't even look at me, just tapped a clipboard on the side of his truck. Orders from the HOA. By the time I reached my car, the truck had already turned the corner, disappearing into the dawn. Then, as if the universe wanted to mock me further, my phone buzzed. "Margaret, your unauthorized vehicle has been removed. Office hours start at 9 a.m. It wasn't even 6 a.m. I exhaled sharply, staring at the message. Margaret had planned this down to the minute, knowing I wouldn't have time to react. She thought she had won. She had no idea who she was dealing with. By the time 9 a.m. rolled around, I was at the HOA office, burning with quiet fury. Margaret sat behind her oversized mahogany desk, a perfectly curated portrait of smugness. Across the room, Tom Peterson twirled his tow truck keys between his fingers, grinning like the cat that ate the canary. "Mr. Zeitz," Margaret cooed, adjusting her pearl necklace. "I assume you're here about your violation?" I clenched my jaw and kept my voice calm. Where's my bike? Safe at Peterson's impound lot. Tom chimed in. Standard retrieval fee is $500. Cash only. I inhaled deeply, suppressing the urge to flip the desk. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started snapping photos of their fraudulent paperwork. Margaret's expression flickered. Photography isn't allowed in the office, she snapped. I smirked. Interesting rule. Is that written down somewhere? Silence. I knew I was onto something, and that meant it was time to dig deeper. That night, fueled by rage and 4 cups of coffee, I went through every HOA document I could find. What I found made my skin crawl. The motorcycle bylaw Margaret had quoted, it was never approved. She had quietly added it to the website 3 months ago. Every vehicle towed in the past year had been removed by Peterson's Towing. In just 3 months, Tom Peterson's company had been paid $47,000 from HOA funds. Even worse, Margaret had moved all HOA banking to a small institution where Tom sat on the board. This wasn't just about my Harley anymore. This was organized theft. I wasn't the only victim. The next morning, I went door to door, speaking with neighbors. One by one, the stories poured out. The Jacksons had their vintage Mustang towed while they were on vacation. The Garcias lost their restored Triumph motorcycle after a violation notice mysteriously appeared. Even Mrs. Chen's grandson had his first car towed during a family dinner. Each of them had been forced to pay outrageous fees, some even losing their vehicles entirely. Margaret and Tom weren't just towing vehicles. They were systematically preying on homeowners. That was when I knew. This wasn't just my fight anymore. This was war. The storm is coming. Margaret thought she could scare me into submission. She had no idea she had just poked the wrong bear. And if she wanted a battle, I was going to give her one she would never forget. By the time I had finished talking to my neighbors, the magnitude of Margaret and Tom's scam was clear. This wasn't just petty HOA power tripping. It was an organized racket, one that had drained thousands from hard-working families while they posed as the keepers of suburban perfection. But if there was one thing I had learned in my years in business, it was this. Corruption leaves a paper trail. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't need sleep. I needed proof. Armed with my laptop, a fresh pot of coffee, and a growing sense of righteous fury, I began digging through every HOA financial record I could access. I scoured through meeting minutes, transaction logs, vendor payments, anything and everything that might contain a clue. And then, at precisely 3:42 a.m., I found it, a small, seemingly insignificant line item buried in the records. Peterson's premium towing service, $47,000. It wasn't just a business expense. It was a pattern. Every single vehicle towed in the last year had been handled by Peterson's Towing. The impound lot, where the vehicles were kept, owned by Tom Peterson's wife. The storage fees they charged were nearly 3 times the state's legal limit. The bank handling these transactions? A small institution where Tom sat on the board of directors. It was a smoking gun. Then, just as I was about to shut my laptop, something else caught my eye. A revised bylaw dated 3 months ago. The same bylaw Margaret had smugly quoted when she justified stealing my Harley. But there was one problem. The board had never actually approved it. Margaret had simply added it to the HOA's website, pretending it was legitimate. I had her. When cornered, rats don't surrender. They bite. And Margaret, it turned out, had one last desperate move up her sleeve. The next morning, I received a notice in the mail. It had been forwarded from my business address, and I immediately recognized the too-perfect cursive handwriting. Margaret, auction notice. Per HOA regulations, any vehicle impounded for unpaid violations will be deemed abandoned and auctioned to the highest bidder. Auction date, this Saturday. My jaw clenched as I read the final line. Rules are rules, Mr. Zeitz. Margaret was trying to sell my bike before I could stop her. I could almost hear her laugh. Pictured herself sipping some overpriced organic tea, patting herself on the back for outsmarting me. But what she didn't realize was that I had already gone nuclear. By the time Saturday came, she wouldn't just lose my bike. She'd lose everything. I made 1 phone call, then 2, then 10. By the end of the day, I had hundreds of messages flooding my inbox. Margaret had made one fatal miscalculation. She thought I was just some guy with a motorcycle. She didn't know she was dealing with the CEO of Harley-Davidson. And in my world, when someone messes with one rider, they mess with all of us. By Friday night, word had spread like wildfire. Motorcycle clubs from all over the state were rolling in. Veterans, police officers, weekend riders, classic bike collectors. They were all coming. Not for violence, not for chaos, for justice. I made sure of one thing. Every single bike was street legal. No noise violations. No reckless riding. No laws broken. We weren't going to give Margaret a single excuse. When Saturday morning arrived, I stepped outside to a sight that made my heart swell with pride. Hundreds of bikers, lined up in perfect formation, engines rumbling like distant thunder. The HOA had never seen anything like it, and neither had Margaret. Margaret had been prepared to deal with one disgruntled homeowner. She had not been prepared to deal with hundreds of bikers, multiple news vans, and a legal team armed with subpoenas. As we pulled into the neighborhood in a slow, controlled procession, I spotted her standing on her porch, frozen in horror. Her pink bathrobe was disheveled, her perfectly styled hair still in curlers. She was clutching her phone like a lifeline. Margaret had ruled this neighborhood with an iron grip for years. But in that moment, she realized her reign was over. I walked up to her porch, an envelope in hand. Beautiful morning for a community gathering, isn't it? I said, handing her the paperwork. She snatched it from me, her hands shaking as she read. Inside was a cease and desist order from my legal team, proof that her towing operation was illegal, photographs of every single unlawful tow, a financial report showing the fraudulent transactions she and Tom had made. Margaret's eyes darted wildly between the documents, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "You can't do this," she hissed. "Oh, but I can," I said, motioning behind me, because standing at the end of the street were two police officers, and one of them was holding a search warrant. By the time the emergency HOA meeting was called, the community center was packed like never before. People who had never dared speak up were now standing in the aisles, crowding the doorways. Margaret sat stiffly at the head of the table, her face ashen, her fingers clutching a stack of meaningless paperwork. Tom Peterson was sweating so profusely that his shirt was visibly damp. And then I took the stage. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Instead, I simply played a security video from my garage. It showed Margaret herself, directing Tom's tow truck to my bike, before the 48-hour notice had expired. The room erupted. Then, I handed over bank statements, fraudulent transactions, and property records. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their stories. Mrs. Garcia's son's bicycle? Gone. The Patel's daughter's first car? Towed during her college graduation party. The Jacksons' vintage Mustang? Sold without their knowledge. Finally, a forensic accountant stood up and announced, "In the past 5 years, Margaret and Tom have stolen over $200,000 from this community." Gasps filled the room. Margaret jumped up, scrambling for her purse. But 2 uniformed officers were already waiting at the door. As they led her and Tom away, she turned to me, her face contorted with rage. "You ruined everything," she spat. I smiled. "No, Margaret," I said, watching as she was taken away. "I just ended it." A community reborn. The next morning, the HOA bylaws were rewritten. The neighborhood transformed. Motorcycle safety courses, youth workshops, and charity rides replaced Margaret's dictatorship. And my Harley? It was back where it belonged, right in my driveway. And this time, no one would dare touch it. As Margaret and Tom were led out of the HOA meeting in handcuffs, a wave of something unfamiliar swept through the neighborhood. Relief. For years, these two had ruled with an iron grip, disguising their corruption under the mask of community standards. They had bullied, extorted, and stolen from hard-working families, all while pretending to be the guardians of property values. But that morning, their empire had crumbled. The police weren't the only ones Margaret had to answer to. The IRS was now interested in her finances. The state attorney general's office had opened an investigation into illegal auctions and fraudulent HOA fees. And, perhaps worst of all, her reputation was in shambles. Her designer sunglasses couldn't hide the panic in her eyes as reporters swarmed, microphones thrust toward her. "Mrs. Whitmore, how do you respond to allegations of fraud?" "Mr. Peterson, is it true you illegally auction off vehicles without proper permits?" "Margaret, did you target motorcycle owners on purpose?" She had no answers now, no smug retorts, no perfectly rehearsed insults, just the look of a woman whose castle had collapsed beneath her. I stepped forward, standing beside a group of my neighbors. Margaret turned, locking eyes with me. Hatred burned behind her expression, but she knew there was nothing left to say. I simply smiled. "Enjoy your new accommodations, Margaret," I said. "I hear the state provides orange jumpsuits for free." She turned away, shoulders slumped in defeat. Checkmate. With Margaret and Tom gone, the neighborhood took on a whole new life. The fear that had hung over our community, like a dark cloud for years, gone. Instead of ridiculous fines and citations, we started focusing on what really mattered, building an actual community. At our first neighborhood meeting post-Margaret, we wiped out half the HOA's pointless rules in one night. No more bans on motorcycles. No more ridiculous restrictions on mailbox distances and lawn lengths. No more hidden fees funneling money into corrupt pockets. But we didn't just stop there. We rebuilt. We launched a free motorcycle safety course for young riders, teaching them responsibility instead of banning them. We started a workshop for teens and retired mechanics where they could learn hands-on skills, fixing up old bikes and cars. We turned the old storage shed, where Margaret used to hoard her secret HOA files, into a community repair garage. It was no longer about rules. It was about helping each other. And the best part? Some of the very same people who once blindly supported Margaret now saw the truth. They started joining in. Even the old HOA board members who once enforced Margaret's tyranny were suddenly different. Hell, one of them even bought a motorcycle. Word spread. Fast. The local news had covered our story, but once it hit the national press, something unexpected happened. People started reaching out. I woke up to hundreds of emails. Homeowners from across the country who had been victims of similar HOA scams. Families who had lost cars, motorcycles, and savings to corrupt HOA officials just like Margaret and Tom. Entire neighborhoods begging for help, asking how they could fight back. I knew right then and there this wasn't just our fight anymore. So I made a call, then another, then 10 more. And just like that, Harley-Davidson launched the Ride Free, Live Fair initiative, a legal defense fund for homeowners battling corrupt HOAs, a support network for people facing illegal property seizures. And best of all, our community became the headquarters. We weren't just fixing our own streets. We were helping neighborhoods all across the country fight back. Margaret had tried to tear us down. Instead, she had started a movement. For 6 months, everything was quiet. Then one morning, I received a letter. At first, I thought it was junk mail. Then I saw the signature. Margaret Whitmore. I laughed out loud. She had moved to a retirement community in Florida, and she had already started pulling the same tricks. Her letter was a pitiful attempt at seeking support against the horrible motorcycle problem in her new neighborhood. I knew exactly what this was. Margaret trying to set up a new scam. So I did what any rational man would do. I sent her back a Harley-Davidson catalog with a handwritten note. Bike still available at employee discount, Margaret. She never wrote back. But I did get an email a few weeks later from a retired judge named Bill living in that very same Florida community. He recognized Margaret from the news stories and had already begun building a case against her. By the time we were done, Margaret wasn't just out of power. She was out of options. It's been over a year now since Margaret and Tom fell. Looking around our neighborhood today, you never know it was once ruled by fear and petty dictatorship. The community repair garage is thriving. The motorcycle safety courses are packed every weekend. And best of all, we don't live in fear anymore. Instead of neighbors avoiding each other, We look out for one another. Instead of wasting money on ridiculous HOA fines, we invest in actual improvements. Instead of being ruled by an out-of-touch tyrant, we govern ourselves. And for me, I look at my Harley, gleaming in my driveway, untouched, unchallenged, and I smile. Margaret had tried to take something from me. Instead, she gave me a mission. She thought the best revenge was winning a fight. But the best revenge is building something better. The end. Or maybe just the beginning. Because somewhere out there, another Margaret is lurking. And now, we all know exactly how to stop her.